December 22nd, 1941. The dirt roads north of de Mortis in the Philippines churned under the tracks of 5 M3 Stuart light tanks as Lieutenant Ben Marin led his platoon from B Company, 192nd Tank Battalion, toward what would become America's first tank versus tank battle of World War II. Behind him, the American and Filipino forces were retreating toward the Bataan Peninsula, desperately buying time against the Japanese invasion that had begun 2 weeks earlier. Ahead, somewhere in the tropical morning heat, Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tanks from the 4th Tank Regiment were advancing. Neither side fully understood what was about to unfold. This was the moment when American tankers would discover that the Japanese Empire had brought not just infantry and aircraft to the Pacific War, but an entirely different philosophy of armoured warfare. The Type 95 Heigo, a tank that Japanese designers had created in the mid-1930s, was about to collide with American industrial might in a series of encounters that would define tank warfare in the Pacific theatre. The story of the Heigo is not simply about a machine. It's about the collision of doctrines, the brutal mathematics of armour and firepower, and the devastating realisation that came to Japanese tank crews as they faced an enemy whose industrial capacity would ultimately bury them under an avalanche of steel. To understand what happened at de Mortis that December morning, we need to go back to 1933, to the snowy plains of Manchuria, where the Imperial Japanese Army was wrestling with a fundamental problem. Their Type 89 medium tank, a reliable workhorse that had served since 1929, was too slow. At a maximum speed of just 15 miles per hour, it couldn't keep pace with motorised infantry travelling at 25 miles per hour in trucks. The Japanese military, observing the mechanised warfare developing in Europe, and having experienced their own campaigns in China, understood that future conflicts would be fought at truck speed, not foot speed. In July 1933, the Japanese infantry and cavalry schools collaborated on specifications for a new light tank. It needed to reach 25 miles per hour, weigh less than the Type 89's 13 tons, and carry a gun powerful enough to support infantry attacks. The Japanese Army Technical Bureau assigned the project to Tomi Ohara, a young engineer who understood that Japan's limited industrial resources demanded efficient, practical designs rather than technological marvels. Hera's team at the Sagami Arsenal completed their first prototype in June 1934. The tank that emerged was small, weighing just 7.5 tons, powered by a 120 horsepower Mitsubishi diesel engine. The design was dominated by practical concerns. Japan had abundant diesel fuel from its Pacific territories, but limited access to high-octane gasoline, making diesel engines a strategic necessity. The tank's armour ranged from just 6 to 12 millimeters thick, barely enough to stop rifle bullets, much less artillery shells. This wasn't ignorance, it was calculated compromise. Japanese military planners had studied their likely opponents in Asia, primarily Chinese forces with minimal anti-tank weapons, and designed accordingly. The Heigo's armament reflected this infantry support role. A 37mm Type 94 gun sat in a small turret operated by a single crewman, the tank commander. This commander had to observe the battlefield, load the gun, aim it, fire it, and command the entire vehicle, all while standing in a cramped turret with a limited visibility. Two 7.7mm machine guns provided additional firepower, one mounted in the hull and another, uniquely, facing rearward from the turret to protect against infantry attacks from behind. The Heigo's suspension system used distinctive bell cranks, large curved arms that connected pairs of road wheels. This simple system was easy to manufacture and maintain, crucial for an army operating thousands of miles from Japanese factories. However, it gave the tank a notoriously rough ride, bouncing crews violently over uneven terrain. Soldiers joked that riding in a Heigo felt like being inside a paint shaker. After modifications to reduce weight and improve reliability, the Japanese army accepted the design in 1935 as the Type 95 Heigo, meaning third model light tank, with 95 representing the year 2595 in the Japanese imperial calendar. Production began at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries factory in 1936, with additional contracts going to other manufacturers as demand grew. The early production models were immediately shipped to Manchuria, where they joined Japanese forces occupying the puppet state of Manchukuo. Here, against Chinese forces armed primarily with rifles and machine guns, the Heigo performed brilliantly. Its speed allowed it to outmaneuver enemy infantry, its armour was sufficient against small arms fire, and its 37mm gun could demolish machine gun positions and light fortifications. Japanese tank crews developed aggressive tactics, racing ahead of their infantry to break through Chinese defensive lines, then wheeling to attack from multiple directions. These successes reinforced Japanese military doctrine that tanks existed primarily to support infantry attacks, not to fight other tanks. In the sprawling campaigns across China from 1937 onward, over half of all Heigo production went to Chinese fronts. Japanese tank regiments, typically with about 40 tanks each, were attached to infantry divisions. The standard practice was to break up tank companies and attach them in small groups to infantry regiments, ensuring that infantry commanders always had armoured support available. This dispersal of tank strength became ingrained in Japanese military thinking. Concentrated armour attacks, the kind that German panzer divisions would perfect in Europe, were seen as wasteful of resources that could better support multiple infantry operations simultaneously. Then came the disaster at Khalkhin Gol in the summer of 1939. Soviet and Japanese forces clashed along the Mongolian-Manchurian border in what began as a minor border incident and escalated into a full-scale mechanized battle. The Japanese 3rd and 4th Tank Regiments, equipped with Heigos and the newer Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, found themselves facing Soviet BT-7 fast tanks and T-26 light tanks in open terrain that favoured mechanized warfare. The results were catastrophic for the Japanese. Soviet tanks, with their 45mm guns and better armour, outranged and outfought the Japanese vehicles. Soviet commanders employed their armour in concentrated formations, overwhelming Japanese positions with mass and firepower. Of 73 Japanese tanks committed to the battle, 42 were destroyed. The Hago's thin armour proved completely inadequate against Soviet guns, and its 37mm weapon couldn't penetrate Soviet tank armour except at suicidally close ranges. Japanese tank crews learned a brutal lesson. Their vehicles, designed to fight Chinese infantry, were helplessly outclassed by purpose-built battle tanks. The Japanese army responded by developing new anti-tank guns and designing improved tank models with better armour and more powerful guns. However, industrial limitations meant these improved designs would take years to produce in meaningful numbers. The Heigo, despite its obvious shortcomings, remained the standard Japanese light tank because Japan simply couldn't afford to replace it. By December 1941, when Japan launched its attacks across the Pacific, approximately 2,000 Heigos had been produced, more than any other Japanese armoured vehicle. When Japanese forces invaded the Philippines on December 8, 1941, they brought substantial armoured forces. The 4th and 7th Tank Regiments, with about 100 tanks between them including numerous Heigos, supported the invasion. Against them stood the American forces in the Philippines, including 2 tank battalions, the 192nd and 194th, equipped with M3 Stuart light tanks that had arrived in the Philippines just months earlier. The M3 Stuart, nicknamed Honey by British tankers for its smooth handling, represented a completely different approach to tank design. Weighing 15 tons, double the Heigo's weight, it carried 32mm of frontal armour compared to the Heigo's 12mm. Both tanks mounted 37mm guns, but the Stuart's turret held 3 men, a commander, gunner and loader, allowing for much faster firing and better situational awareness. The Stuart's 220 horsepower engine gave it a top speed of 36 miles per hour, making it faster than the Heigo despite being twice as heavy. On December 22, 1941, north of De Mortis, these 2 tank types met in combat for the first time. Lieutenant Morin's 5 Stuarts were nearly out of fuel, having failed to refuel at their planned location. They faced an unknown number of Heigos from the 4th Tank Regiment, advancing down the same road. The engagement was brief and chaotic. Japanese tanks following, their doctrine, were spread in small groups supporting infantry units rather than concentrated as an armoured strike force. The American tanks, despite their fuel shortage, had the advantage of heavier armour. Japanese 37mm armour-piercing rounds could penetrate the Stuart's side armour at close range but bounced off the frontal plates. American gunners discovered their 37mm guns could punch through Heigo armour from almost any angle. In the swirling engagement, one Stuart was hit and destroyed, likely by a lucky shot to its thinner side armour. The remaining 4 Stuarts fell back after running critically low on fuel. The Japanese claimed victory, having forced the Americans to retreat. But the encounter revealed an uncomfortable truth to both sides. The Heigo could fight the Stuart, but only under favourable conditions at close range, attacking from the sides or rear. In a straight fight, hull front to hull front, the Stuart's superior armour gave it a decisive edge. Over the following weeks, as American and Filipino forces retreated into the Bataan Peninsula, tank battles continued. On December 31, 1941, American M3 tanks managed to destroy 8 Heigos in a single engagement. The pattern was becoming clear. When American tankers got the first shot, positioned their tanks to present frontal armour, and used their better optics to engage at range, they won. When Japanese tanks achieved surprise, attacked from favourable positions, or caught American vehicles with infantry support, they could succeed. By April 1942, the American forces on Bataan had been overwhelmed, not by tank battles, but by the sheer weight of Japanese infantry and artillery. The 2 American tank battalions were destroyed or captured, their Stuarts taken as prizes by Japanese forces who studied them intensely, trying to understand how American industry produced such heavily armoured and well-equipped vehicles. The Philippine campaign gave the Heigo its only significant success against American armour in the entire war. And even that success came not from tank versus tank combat, but from the collapse of American defences under overwhelming force. Meanwhile, Japanese armour was achieving spectacular success in Malaya and Burma. British and Commonwealth forces in Malaya in December 1941 had almost no tanks. British commanders had declared the Malayan jungle impassable to armour, a catastrophic miscalculation. Japanese Hagos from the 1st, 6th and 14th Tank Regiments proved that the jungle was not impassable at all. Racing down roads and even pushing through rubber plantations, they terrorised British infantry, who had no effective anti-tank weapons. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 appeared to validate Japanese tank doctrine. Their light, fast tanks, supporting aggressive infantry attacks, had conquered an entire peninsula in just 70 days. But these victories were achieved against enemies with little or no armour. The true test would come when Japanese tanks faced American forces equipped with the weapons that American industry was producing in vast quantities. That test began in August 1942 at Guadalcanal, where the US Marines launched America's first major offensive operation of the Pacific War. The Marines' 1st Tank Battalion landed with M2A4 light tanks, essentially identical to the M3 Stuart but slightly older. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal included a company of Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, not Heigos, but the pattern established there would define all subsequent tank combat in the Pacific. Japanese tanks, employed in small numbers supporting infantry attacks, were systematically destroyed by American tanks working as part of combined arms teams. Marine infantry, supported by tanks, artillery and naval gunfire, created a killing zone that Japanese armour entered at its peril. At Tarawa in November 1943, 7 Heigos were dug into defensive positions, used as stationary pillboxes rather than mobile weapons. All 7 were destroyed by Marine tanks and infantry assault teams. This would become the Heigo's fate across the Pacific, buried in the sand or coral, its thin armour providing barely more protection than a concrete bunker, waiting for American forces to arrive with flamethrowers, bazookas, and Sherman tanks. The fundamental problem facing the Heigo wasn't just its thin armour or weak gun, it was the philosophy behind its creation. Japanese tank doctrine, developed fighting Chinese infantry and frozen by industrial limitations, never evolved to meet the reality of mechanized warfare against a peer opponent. Meanwhile, American tank development continued rapidly. By 1943, the M4 Sherman medium tank was reaching the Pacific in large numbers. The Sherman, at 33 tons, weighed more than 4 Heigos combined. Its 75mm gun could destroy any Japanese tank with a single hit at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Its frontal armour, 50 to 75mm thick depending on the variant, was completely impervious to the Heigo's 37mm gun. Japanese tank crews facing Shermans were not engaged in combat, they were participating in their own execution. The Battle of Saipan in June 1944 demonstrated this with brutal clarity. On the night of June 16th into the early morning of June 17th, Colonel Takashi Goto led the largest Japanese tank attack of the Pacific War. the 9th Tank Regiment, with 44 tanks including both Type 95 Hagos and Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, launched a night assault against the 2nd Marine Division's beachhead. Japanese commanders hoped that a concentrated armoured attack, supported by infantry, could drive the Marines back into the sea. At 2 a.m, under cover of darkness, the Japanese tanks rolled forward. Marine observers immediately called for star shells from offshore destroyers. The night sky lit up with artificial daylight, revealing the advancing Japanese armour. What followed was a slaughter. Marine M4 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Tank Battalion opened fire at ranges where Japanese returned fire was ineffective. The Sherman's 75mm gun, loaded with high explosive rounds, didn't just penetrate Japanese tanks, it disintegrated them. Turrets were blown off hulls, ammunition cooked off, turning tanks into pyres that burned throughout the night. Marine infantry, equipped with the newly issued bazooka rocket launchers, discovered they could knock out Japanese tanks with single shots to the thinner side and rear armour. Japanese tankers found themselves in a nightmare. Their training emphasised aggressive attacks, closing with the enemy, breaking through defensive lines. But every principle of their doctrine failed against the firepower arrayed against them. Move forward, and the Sherman's 75mm gun would find you at 800 yards. Get close enough to use your 37mm gun, and Marine bazookas would hit you from the flanks. Try to manoeuvre and coordinated artillery fire, directed by radio-equipped forward observers, would rain down with devastating accuracy. By dawn on June 17th, 31 of Colonel Goto's 44 tanks were smoking wrecks. The Japanese infantry supporting the attack had been cut down by machine gun fire and artillery. The survivors retreated in disorder. It was the largest tank battle of the Pacific War, and it had lasted less than 5 hours from start to finish. The few remaining Japanese tanks on Saipan were used in small, desperate attacks, or dug in as static pillboxes, where they were systematically hunted down and destroyed over the following weeks. A Marine sergeant, viewing the destroyed Japanese tanks after the battle, wrote in his diary that they looked like children's toys that had been stepped on by an angry adult. This imagery, crude but accurate, captured the essential reality. The Hogo and its Japanese counterparts were not bad tanks for their era. In 1935, the Heigo was comparable to light tanks fielded by other nations. By 1944, it was a relic facing weapons designed for an entirely different generation of warfare. The reasons for this gap were not primarily technical. Japanese engineers understood tank design principles as well as their Western counterparts. The problem was industrial capacity and strategic priorities. Japan's industrial base was a fraction of America's. The United States produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks during World War II. Japan produced approximately 2,300 Hagos and about 3,000 of all other tank types combined. These numbers tell the story of the war in miniature. For every tank Japan built, America built 10. American factories operated around the clock, staffed by workers who had never seen a tank before Pearl Harbor, but who learned to assemble complex machines to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Japanese factories, increasingly targeted by American bombers, struggled to maintain any production at all. Moreover, Japan faced a terrible choice in allocating its limited industrial resources. Should they build more tanks, knowing that America would simply build more tanks faster? Or should they focus on aircraft and ships, the weapons that might still allow Japan to defend its Pacific Empire? The Imperial Japanese Navy, Japan's senior service, demanded priority for warship construction. The army, despite knowing its armour was obsolete, had to accept whatever industrial capacity remained after the Navy's needs were met. Advanced Japanese tank designs existed on paper. The Type 3 Chinu medium tank, armed with a 75mm gun that could potentially engage Shermans on more equal terms, was designed in 1943. Production began in 1944. Only 166 were built before the war ended. The Type 4 Chito, with a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun and improved armour, reached prototype stage in 1944. 2 were built. These advanced tanks were kept in Japan, held back for the final defence of the home islands that never came. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Islands, obsolete Hagos and Type 97s faced the full weight of American mechanized warfare. By 1944, a typical American infantry division landed with its own tank battalion, 54 medium tanks organized into 4 companies. Marine divisions had their own tank battalions, usually equipped with the diesel-powered M4A2 Sherman variant. These battalions didn't operate in isolation. They worked as part of combined arms teams that included infantry, artillery, combat engineers, and air support, all coordinating through radio communications that Japanese forces could only dream of. An American tank attack in the Pacific followed a pattern that Japanese defenders learned to dread but could rarely counter. First, naval gunfire and aerial bombardment would soften defensive positions. Then artillery would begin a systematic bombardment, walking fire across Japanese lines. Behind the artillery curtain, Sherman tanks would advance, their 75mm guns destroying any bunkers or defensive positions that revealed themselves. Behind the tanks came infantry, using the armour as mobile cover. If Japanese forces tried to counterattack, as their doctrine demanded, they ran into coordinated fire from tanks, infantry, artillery, and often naval guns that could drop 5-inch shells with devastating precision. Japanese tank crews facing this system understood they were doomed. Post-war interviews with captured Japanese tankers revealed a consistent pattern. Early in the war, tankers spoke confidently about their tactics and training. By 1944, they spoke of terror and helplessness. Sergeant Shiro Shimoda, a Type 95 Heigo commander captured on Saipan, described his company's encounter with Sherman tanks. "We opened fire as soon as we saw them, but our shells just bounced off like baseballs hitting a wall. Then they turned their main guns toward us. The first round blew the turret completely off the tank next to mine. The second round hit our tank in the engine. The whole rear exploded into flames. We bailed out, but only I survived. The others were cut down by machine gun fire as they tried to run." Shimoda's account matches hundreds of similar testimonies. Japanese tank crews knew they couldn't win. They attacked anyway because their orders demanded it, and because the alternative, sitting in place, meant dying to artillery or aerial bombardment without even the honour of combat. This is the larger tragedy of the Heigo. Not that it was a poor tank by 1944 standards. That was inevitable given Japan's industrial limitations. The tragedy is that Japanese commanders continued sending these tanks and their crews into hopeless attacks, following a doctrine that no longer matched battlefield reality. The rigid hierarchical culture of the Japanese military made it nearly impossible for junior officers to question doctrine or suggest alternatives. Senior commanders, many of whom had formed their understanding of warfare in the 1920s and 1930s, struggled to adapt to a form of mechanized warfare that Japan simply couldn't practice due to lack of resources. On Peleliu in September 1944, Japanese commanders tried a different approach. Instead of counterattacking with their tanks, they kept them hidden in defensive positions, using them as mobile artillery to support infantry. This was more effective, but only slightly. American forces expecting Japanese armour to counterattack were initially surprised by its absence. But Marine combat engineers, working with tanks and infantry, systematically cleared Japanese positions, using flamethrower tanks and demolition charges to destroy Heigos in their hidden positions. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, the Japanese had no tanks at all. The Holgos that might have been sent there were kept in Japan or Manchuria. Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima, knowing tanks would be useless against American firepower, didn't even request them. Instead, they built an elaborate system of tunnels and bunkers, turning the island into a fortress that took American forces over a month to capture at terrible cost. This shift from mobile warfare to static defense represented the complete failure of Japanese armored doctrine. Tanks existed to enable movement, to break through enemy lines, to exploit breakthroughs with rapid advances. By 1945, Japanese tanks were either buried as pillboxes or held back in Japan, waiting for an invasion that would be prevented by atomic bombs. The Heigo's final major combat came not against American forces, but against the Soviet Red Army in August 1945. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, Japanese forces there included numerous tank regiments equipped with Heigos and other Japanese armour. These units faced Soviet tank armies equipped with T-34 medium tanks and heavy IS-2 tanks, the same vehicles that had crushed German armour at Kursk and in the drive to Berlin. The Manchurian campaign was a disaster for Japanese armour. Soviet tanks, operating in massed formations with overwhelming air support, cut through Japanese defensive positions like paper. Haigos that had been stationed in Manchuria for years, maintained carefully against the day they might fight the Soviet Union, were destroyed in hours. The Battle of Shumshu in the Kuril Islands saw one of the last uses of Haigos in the offensive role they were designed for. Japanese armour counterattacked Soviet forces that had landed on the island, attempting to drive them back into the sea. The attack failed, stopped by Soviet anti-tank guns and infantry. By the time the war ended with Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the Haigo had become a symbol of Japan's failed military strategy. It represented competent design executed within severe constraints, produced in inadequate numbers, and employed according to a doctrine that couldn't adapt to changing warfare. Approximately 2,300 Haigos were produced between 1935 and 1943, when production finally stopped. Of these, hundreds were destroyed across the Pacific Islands, dozens were captured and used for intelligence evaluation or displayed as war trophies, and several hundred remained in China when the war ended. These Chinese Haigos had an unexpected afterlife. When the Chinese Civil War resumed after Japan's defeat, both nationalist and communist forces used captured Japanese tanks. Haigos fought on both sides, their thin armour and weak guns still sufficient against infantry, in a conflict where neither side had significant armour. When the communists won in 1949, surviving Haigos became part of the People's Liberation Army. Some even saw service in the early phases of the Korean War, where they faced American M4 Shermans once again with predictable results. The last combat use of the Haigo came in the 1950s, when French forces in Indochina used a few captured examples against Viet Minh guerrillas. By then the tank was 20 years old, hopelessly obsolete even against infantry armed with World War II-era anti-tank weapons. Today, Haigos survive in museums around the world. The Australian War Memorial houses a Haigo that was captured at Milne Bay in 1942, one of only 2 Japanese tanks deployed there, both of which became bogged in mud within days. The tank is riddled with bullet holes from Australian infantry who shot at it with .303 rifles in a futile attempt to disable it. Other holes mark where Australian troops tested their boys' anti-tank rifle against it, discovering that the rifle could penetrate the Haigo's thin armour. The US Army Ordnance Museum at Fort Benning has a Haigo that was used for weapons testing after the war. American engineers fired various weapons at it to determine optimal tactics for defeating Japanese armour. The test results were anticlimactic. Virtually every anti-tank weapon in the American arsenal could defeat the Haigo's armour. Even the .50 caliber heavy machine gun, firing armour-piercing rounds, could penetrate the Haigo's side armour at close range. The Tank Museum at Bovington in England displayed a fully restored running Haigo that was recovered from a Pacific island and restored in Poland. This tank has since been sold to a Japanese buyer and returned to Japan for display, a fitting end for a vehicle that never fought on Japanese soil. These museum pieces are all that remain of the Type 95 Haigo's service. They sit silent, their diesel engines cold, their 37mm guns empty. Visitors walk around them, noting their small size, their thin armour, their cramped interiors. The Haigo looks fragile, almost delicate, compared to the Shermans and Panzers displayed nearby. But the Haigo's legacy isn't found in museums. It's found in the mathematical brutality of the Pacific War's tank battles. At Tarawa, 7 Haigos faced American Shermans and bazookas. All 7 were destroyed. At Saipan, 44 Japanese tanks attacked the Marine beachhead. 31 were destroyed in one night. On Guam, 29 Type 97s and Type 95s were lost to bazookas and M4 tanks in a single campaign. The pattern repeated on Tinian, Peleliu, Leyte, Luzon, and every other island where Japanese armour made its last stand. The statistics are devastating. Across the Pacific War, Japanese tank units achieved a kill ratio of approximately 1 to 10 when facing American armour. For every American tank destroyed, 10 Japanese tanks were knocked out. And these losses don't account for the Haigos dug in as pillboxes, destroyed by artillery or aerial bombing before they could even engage American forces. The Haigo entered combat in 1941 as a competent light tank, adequate for its designed role of supporting infantry against Asian opponents with limited anti-tank capability. It ended the war in 1945 as a death trap on treads, sending crews into battles they couldn't win, against weapons they couldn't counter, in service of a doctrine that had failed. The American tankers who faced Hargos in combat remember them without much respect but with some pity. "They were brave," one Sherman commander recalled decades after the war. "They'd charge at us knowing they couldn't penetrate our armour, knowing we'd blow them apart. But they'd do it anyway because their orders said to attack. You couldn't help but respect that kind of courage even as you were killing them." This perhaps is the final word on the Type 95 Heigo. It was a tank designed for a war Japan could afford to fight, employed in a war Japan couldn't win, against an enemy whose industrial might made the outcome inevitable from the start. When that first Hargo faced Lieutenant Morin Stuart's at De Mortis in December 1941, the pattern was set. The Japanese tank would fight with tactical skill and desperate courage, but it would be buried under American firepower and industrial production, one tank battle at a time, until nothing remained but wrecks rusting in Pacific jungles and the memory of crews who died following orders that sent them against impossible odds. The mathematics were simple and brutal. America produced 49,000 Shermans. Japan produced 2,300 Hogos. No amount of courage, no tactical brilliance, no fighting. Spirit could overcome that arithmetic. The Heigo's story is ultimately the story of the Pacific War itself, told in steel and fire, a story where industrial capacity defeated military virtue, where quantity and quality combined to create overwhelming superiority, and where the outcome was never truly in doubt once the full weight of American production turned toward the Pacific. The day the Japanese Heigo tank met American armour was the day Japan's tank forces began a long retreat that would end only with complete defeat. The tanks are gone now, scrapped for metal or preserved in museums, but their story remains as a testament to the futility of fighting industrial warfare without industrial capacity, and to the young men who died in metal coffins because their nation's strategy had failed before the first shot was ever fired. The technical specifications tell only part of the Heigo's story. To understand why Japanese tank crews found themselves so catastrophically outmatched, we need to examine the industrial and strategic decisions that created the tank in the first place, and why Japan never developed a successor that could compete with American armour. In 1935, when the Heigo entered production, Japan's entire steel production was approximately 4.6 million tons annually. The United States produced 34 million tons that same year. This wasn't just a numerical difference. It was a fundamental constraint that shaped every aspect of Japanese military equipment. Japanese engineers couldn't simply design thicker armour that required steel Japan didn't have. They couldn't create more powerful engines without access to advanced metallurgy and machine tools that Japan's industrial base struggled to produce. The Heigo's diesel engine represented one area where Japanese engineers made brilliant use of limited resources. The Mitsubishi Type 100 air-cooled diesel produced 120 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute. Air cooling eliminated the need for radiators, coolant pumps, and the vulnerable cooling system that could be disabled by a single bullet. Diesel fuel was less flammable than gasoline, giving crews a slightly better chance of survival if hit. The engine was reliable, simple to maintain, and could run on lower quality fuel than gasoline engines demanded. Japanese tankers loved their diesel engines, even when everything else about their tanks was inadequate. Lieutenant Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who would later command forces at Iwo Jima, wrote in 1937 about his experience with the Heigo during operations in China. "The engine never fails us. In dust storms that clog everything, in monsoon rains that flood roads, in heat that makes the tank interior unbearable, the diesel keeps running. Whatever criticisms I might have of this tank, the engine is not among them, but an excellent engine couldn't compensate for armour that was fundamentally inadequate. The Hargo's maximum armour thickness was 12 mm, and that was only on the front glacis plate. The turret sides were 12 mm, the hull sides 12 mm, but the rear armour was just 6 mm, and the top armour was 6 mm everywhere. To put this in perspective, the American M2 Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun, firing armour-piercing ammunition, could penetrate 15 mm of armour at 500 yards. This meant that American infantry, equipped with weapons designed for anti-aircraft use, could penetrate a Heigo's armour from almost any angle. The 30 caliber rifle caliber machine guns that every American tank carried could penetrate the Heigo's rear and top armour. Japanese tank crews operating in the Pacific learned to fear American aircraft, not because of bombs or rockets, but because strafing runs from fighter aircraft could kill them through their own armour. Marine Corsair and Navy Hellcat fighters discovered they could destroy Haigos with their 650 caliber machine guns, simply by making low-level strafing passes that stitched the thin armour with armour-piercing rounds. Lieutenant James Sweat, a Marine Corsair pilot who would earn the Medal of Honor for his actions at Guadalcanal, described attacking Japanese tanks during the Marshall Islands campaign. "We'd come in low, maybe 50 feet off the ground, and just hold the trigger down. The armour-piercing rounds we carried would punch right through the top armour of those Japanese tanks. You'd see them start smoking, then the crew would bail out if they could. Sometimes they couldn't because the ammunition cooked off too fast. It wasn't really a fair fight. We were using anti-aircraft weapons against ground targets, but it worked. The Japanese armament also reflected the constraints of limited industrial capacity. The Type 94 37mm gun was a competent weapon by 1935 standards. It could penetrate 45mm of armour at 100 yards using armour-piercing rounds, adequate against the light tanks most nations fielded in the mid-1930s. The gun fired a 1.5-pound projectile at about 2,300 feet per second. For comparison, the American 37mm gun mounted in the M3 Stuart fired a nearly identical round at similar velocity. On paper, the guns were equivalent. In practice, the Japanese gun suffered from several disadvantages. First, it was manually loaded by the tank commander, who also had to aim and fire it while trying to command the vehicle. This meant a slower rate of fire compared to American tanks, where a dedicated loader could keep ammunition flowing to a dedicated gunner. Second, Japanese armour-piercing ammunition was of inconsistent quality. Steel shortages meant that some batches of ammunition used lower-grade steel that shattered on impact rather than penetrating. Tank crews learned to test-fire new ammunition batches when possible, but this wasn't always feasible in combat conditions. Third, the Japanese didn't develop sophisticated ammunition types as the war progressed. American tanks by 1943 were firing armour-piercing capped rounds with ballistic caps that improved penetration. They had canister rounds filled with steel balls for use against infantry. They had high explosive rounds optimized for different targets. Japanese 37mm ammunition remained essentially unchanged from 1935 to 1945. The tank's machine guns presented their own problems. The 7.7mm Type 97 machine gun, based on the Czech ZB-26 design, was reliable and effective against infantry. But the Haigo's unusual configuration, with one machine gun in the hull, front operated by the driver and another in the turret rear operated by the commander, meant that bringing both guns to bear on a single target was nearly impossible. The rear-facing machine gun, intended to protect against infantry assault from behind, was a solution to a problem that existed in Chinese warfare, where Japanese tanks often found themselves surrounded by infantry. Against American forces, who coordinated their infantry attacks with armour and artillery support, the rear machine gun was nearly useless. It occupied space and weight that could have been used for additional ammunition or slightly better armour. The Haigo's greatest weakness wasn't armour or armament, though both were inadequate. It was the crew configuration. The tank required 4 men, a driver, a hull machine gunner, a radio operator, and a commander who also served as loader, gunner, and turret machine gunner. This commander, working alone in the turret, faced an impossible workload. Compare this to the American M3 Stuart, which had a crew of 4 in early models and 5 in later versions. The Stuart's turret held 3 men, a commander who could focus on observing the battlefield and directing the tank, a gunner who aimed and fired the main gun, and a loader who kept ammunition flowing. This division of labour meant faster firing, better accuracy, and superior situational awareness. The Stuart's commander could spend his time looking for targets, coordinating with other tanks via radio, and making tactical decisions. The Haigo's commander was too busy loading and firing the gun to do any of those things effectively. Japanese tank radios compounded this problem. Early Haigos had no radio at all. Later models received radios, but only one tank per platoon typically carried one, and even then, the radio operator position was often eliminated to save space, with the driver trying to operate the radio when needed. American tank platoons, in contrast, had radios in every tank by 1942. Tank commanders could talk to each other, coordinate movements, call for artillery support, and communicate with infantry. This communications advantage multiplied American tactical flexibility. When a Marine Sherman spotted a Haigo, the commander could immediately alert other Shermans, coordinate a flanking movement, and have all tanks engaged simultaneously. Japanese Heigo commanders, lacking inter-tank communication, fought as individuals rather than as coordinated units. The Heigos, suspension and running gear, while mechanically simple and easy to maintain, gave the tank poor cross-country performance. The bell crank suspension with its large return rollers created a distinctive profile, but it also limited suspension travel. The tank bounced violently over rough terrain, making accurate firing while moving nearly impossible. The narrow tracks, just 11 inches wide, gave poor flotation in soft ground. Heigos routinely became stuck in mud or sand, requiring recovery by other vehicles or abandonment. At Cape Gloucester in New Britain, Marine forces advancing through jungle encountered 2 Heigos that had been abandoned by their crews after becoming hopelessly mired in mud. The tanks had sunk to their hulls in the soft ground, their narrow tracks unable to provide enough flotation. Marine engineers recovered one for intelligence purposes, noting in their report that the tank's ground pressure was nearly 50% higher than an American Sherman despite weighing less than a quarter as much. The Heigo's limited fuel capacity restricted its operational range to about 150 miles under ideal conditions. In the Pacific's rough terrain, actual range was often less than 100 miles. This meant Japanese tanks needed frequent refueling, but Japanese logistics struggled to deliver fuel to forward units. Many Heigos were destroyed not in combat, but after being abandoned when they ran out of fuel and couldn't be recovered. On Luzon in 1945, American forces advancing toward Manila discovered numerous Japanese tanks abandoned along roads, their fuel tanks empty, their crews having removed key components to prevent American use. The tanks sat as monuments to Japan's logistical failure, machines rendered useless not by enemy action but by lack of fuel. Japanese tank crews received extensive training in the 1930s when Japan's military was well funded and preparing for continental warfare. Tankers trained at specialized schools, practiced maneuvers in Manchuria's open terrain, and developed tactical proficiency. But as the war progressed and losses mounted, training quality collapsed. By 1944, new tank crews received minimal instruction. Sergeant Yoshio Takatsuka, captured on Saipan, described his training in a post-war interrogation. I was assigned to a tank unit in March 1944. We trained for 6 weeks total. Most of that time was spent on maintenance and basic driving. We fired the main gun exactly 3 times during training, 3 rounds. That was supposed to prepare us for combat against the Americans who had been training for months or years. When we reached Saipan and saw the American tanks, massive steel monsters that dwarfed our Hargo, I knew we had no chance. But we were soldiers. We would fight anyway. The quality gap extended beyond training to doctrine. Japanese tank tactics emphasized aggressive frontal attacks, closing quickly with the enemy, using speed and surprise to overcome firepower disadvantages. These tactics worked against Chinese forces who often broke and ran when tanks appeared. They failed catastrophically against American forces who held their positions, coordinated with supporting arms, and systematically destroyed attacking tanks with overwhelming firepower. Japanese officers, trained in a military culture that emphasized offensive spirit and aggressive action, struggled to adapt when those principles led to disaster. The concept of husbanding forces, of fighting defensively to inflict casualties while preserving your own strength, was seen as defeatist. Tank units were expected to attack even when defense would have been more effective. At Tarawa, the 7 Heigos dug in as static defenses actually performed reasonably well until they were systematically hunted down by Marine combat engineers. Had Japanese commanders used their tanks more frequently in defensive roles, integrated into comprehensive defensive systems, they might have inflicted more casualties. But Japanese doctrine demanded counterattacks, and tank commanders obeyed even when it meant driving into killing zones where American Shermans waited. The industrial disparity grew worse as the war continued. American factories in 1943 produced more tanks in a single month than Japan produced in the entire year. The famous Willow Run plant in Michigan, built to produce B-24 bombers, covered 3.5 million square feet under one roof. The entire plant could have held every tank factory in Japan with room to spare. American workers at tank plants earned good wages, worked in safe conditions, had access to advanced machine tools and abundant materials. Japanese factory workers, increasingly composed of conscripted students and Korean forced labourers, worked longer hours for less pay with inferior tools and chronic material shortages. The quality difference showed in the finished products. American Shermans rolled off assembly lines with standardized parts, comprehensive technical manuals, and full sets of spare parts. Japanese tanks left factories with whatever parts were available, minimal documentation, and the understanding that spare parts would be scarce. When a Sherman broke down, recovery vehicles towed it to maintenance units that had parts, tools, and trained mechanics. When a Heigo broke down, crews often had to fabricate parts by hand or cannibalize other damaged tanks. The American logistics system could deliver a replacement engine to a forward tank unit in the Pacific within days. The Japanese logistics system struggled to deliver food to frontline troops, let alone tank engines. This industrial and logistical superiority meant that even when Heigos achieved tactical success, the strategic outcome never changed. On Luzon in January 1945, a platoon of Heigos managed to ambush a company of American Shermans, destroying 3 tanks in the opening minutes of combat. The Japanese tankers executed their ambush perfectly, hitting the American tanks from concealed positions at close range where their 37mm guns could penetrate side armor. Then American doctrine and industrial power asserted itself. The surviving Shermans immediately called for artillery support. Within minutes, 105mm howitzer shells were falling on the Japanese positions. The Sherman Company backed out of the kill zone while a second Sherman Company maneuvered to flank the Japanese position. American infantry moved forward to fix the Japanese tanks in place. Fighter bombers arrived overhead within 20 minutes, directed to the target by radio. The entire American military machine focused on eliminating the threat. All 4 Heigos were destroyed within an hour. Even when Japanese tanks won the immediate tactical engagement, they lost the larger battle because American forces could bring overwhelming firepower to bear faster than Japanese forces could exploit success. Compare this to the German experience on the Eastern Front, where tactical success could sometimes be exploited into operational advantage. German panzer units, breaking through Soviet lines, could advance rapidly into rear areas, disrupting logistics and creating chaos. Japanese tanks couldn't do this because they lacked the fuel capacity, the spare parts, the logistics support, and the air cover necessary for exploitation. A breakthrough simply led to Japanese tanks being surrounded and destroyed when American forces counterattacked. The Heigo's final weakness was one that no amount of Japanese engineering could overcome. It couldn't be upgraded. The Stuart evolved into the M5 Stuart with improved armour and better engines. The Sherman spawned dozens of variants with different guns, armour packages, and specialised roles. The Heigo remained essentially unchanged from 1935 to 1945 because its basic design couldn't accommodate improvements. The chassis was too small to mount a larger gun. The engine compartment couldn't fit a more powerful engine. The hull couldn't be thickened without exceeding weight limits that would have required stronger suspension, which would have required redesigning the entire tank. Japanese engineers proposed numerous improvements: add belly armour to protect against mines, install smoke dischargers to aid in breaking contact, mount a 47mm gun for better anti-tank capability. Every proposal founded on the same reality. The Heigo's basic design, optimized for weight and production simplicity, had no margin for improvement. Implementing any significant upgrade meant designing a completely new tank, which Japan's industrial capacity couldn't support while simultaneously building aircraft, ships, and weapons for every other branch of the military. The Type 3 Chinu medium tank, Japan's attempt to create a Sherman equivalent, illustrates this problem perfectly. Armed with a 75mm gun and thicker armour, the Chinu was a decent design that reached prototype stage in 1944. Only 166 were ever built. Japanese factories simply couldn't produce the Chinu in meaningful numbers while also building aircraft, and aircraft were deemed more important for defending against American bomber raids. So the Heigo remained in production through 1943, and Heigos already built remained in service through 1945, their crews sent into combat in tanks that were obsolete death traps. On Okinawa, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War, Japanese forces had no tanks at all. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding Japanese forces on the island, deliberately chose not to request tanks. He had studied the battles on Saipan, Tinian, and Peleliu. He understood that Japanese tanks survived longest when they weren't used. So on Okinawa, a battle involving 180,000 American troops and 100,000 Japanese defenders, Not a single Japanese tank participated. This absence represents the complete failure of Japanese armoured warfare doctrine. Tanks exist to enable mobile operations, to break through defensive lines, to exploit breakthroughs. By April 1945, Japanese commanders understood that using tanks meant losing them immediately without accomplishing anything. Better to build fortifications, dig tunnels, create elaborate defensive positions. Better to fight on foot than die in a steel coffin that offered no protection against American firepower. The psychological impact on Japanese tank crews was devastating. Corporal Hideo Kusunoki, captured on Leyte after his Heigo was disabled by a bazooka, described the experience in a 1946 interview. "We knew before we ever saw the enemy that we would die. Our officers told us we were making a glorious sacrifice for the Emperor. They told us American tanks were soft, that American soldiers were cowards who would flee when we attacked. None of it was true. The American tanks were monsters that our guns couldn't hurt. Their soldiers didn't flee, they stood and fought with weapons that destroyed us easily. I saw my entire platoon destroyed in less than 10 minutes, 6 tanks gone, most of my friends dead. I only survived because my tank was hit in the engine and stopped before we reached the American lines. I pretended to be dead in the wreckage until American soldiers pulled me out. I felt shame for surviving when my comrades died, but I also felt relief that I would never have to climb into that tank again." This testimony appears repeatedly in interrogation records. Japanese tank crews spoke of fear, helplessness, and the knowledge that they were being sacrificed in hopeless attacks. Some crews, ordered to conduct suicide attacks against American positions, disabled their own tanks rather than face certain death. Courts-martial records from Japanese forces on Luzon document cases of tank crews sabotaging their vehicles to avoid combat. This wasn't cowardice, it was rational response to impossible situations. The Hago story intersects with one of World War II's most controversial decisions: the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When American planners contemplated invading Japan in 1945, they studied Japanese tank strength and concluded that Japan retained approximately 2,000 tanks of all types in the home islands. Most of these were Heigos and Type 97s, supplemented by a few hundred of the newer Type 3 and Type 4 tanks. American intelligence assessed that Japanese tanks would be used in mass suicide attacks against landing beaches, attempting to destroy American forces during the vulnerable initial phases of an invasion. The Americans planned to counter this with overwhelming firepower. The invasion force would have included entire armoured divisions equipped with the latest Sherman variants, including flamethrower tanks, dozer tanks, and tanks armed with 105mm howitzers for destroying fortifications. Naval gunfire would have devastated any Japanese armour attempting to reach the beaches. Fighter bombers would have saturated the landing zones. But American planners still estimated tens of thousands of American casualties in the initial landings, partly because Japanese tanks, even obsolete ones, posed a threat to troops coming ashore. The decision to use atomic weapons, motivated by many factors, included the calculation that invasion would be extraordinarily costly. The Hago, obsolete and outmatched, still represented enough of a threat when multiplied by thousands of tanks and suicidal determination that American planners sought alternatives to invasion. The atomic bombs made Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, unnecessary. The 2,000 Japanese tanks waiting in the home islands never fired their guns in defense of Japan. They were scrapped for metal after the war or given to occupation forces for study. A few were preserved in museums. The rest became part of Japan's post-war steel industry, melted down and reformed into peaceful products. In the decades after the war, military historians debated the Hago's place in tank development. Some argued it was simply a failure, a product of industrial weakness and strategic miscalculation. Others suggested it was an adequate design poorly employed. The truth lies somewhere between. The Hago was a competent design for the mission it was originally intended to perform, supporting infantry attacks against opponents with minimal anti-tank capability. It succeeded brilliantly in China and Malaya, where it faced enemies with little armour and limited anti-tank weapons. It failed catastrophically in the Pacific, where it faced an enemy with superior tanks, abundant anti-tank weapons, and an industrial base that could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The Hago's fundamental problem was that it was designed for the war Japan wanted to fight, not the war Japan actually had to fight. Japanese military planners in the 1930s envisioned continental warfare against China, and possibly the Soviet Union, conflicts where infantry would be the decisive arm, and tanks would support infantry operations. They got instead a Pacific War against an enemy who treated combined arms operations as doctrine, who could coordinate tanks, infantry, artillery, air power, and naval gunfire into an integrated system that Japanese forces couldn't match. No amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome that systemic disadvantage. The final chapter of the Heigo story involves a peculiar footnote. When the Chinese Civil War ended with communist victory in 1949, the new People's Republic of China took control of all remaining Japanese equipment in Chinese territory. This included hundreds of Heigos that had been used by various Chinese factions during the Civil War. The new Chinese government, desperately short of modern weapons, pressed these Heigos into service with the People's Liberation Army. In November 1950, Chinese forces entered the Korean War, and some units brought their Heigos with them. These tanks, now 15 years old, faced American M4 Shermans and the new M26 Pershing heavy tanks. The results were predictable and tragic. Chinese Heigos were destroyed in every engagement. American tank crews reported that killing Chinese tanks was easier than the training exercises they had conducted back in the United States. The Chinese quickly withdrew their remaining armour, recognizing that 15-year-old Japanese light tanks had no place on a modern battlefield. By 1951, the last Heigos in military service had been retired or destroyed. The tank that had entered combat in 1937 had finally reached the end of its operational life, not through obsolescence alone, but through complete irrelevance. Modern anti-tank weapons could destroy a Heigo from ranges where the Heigo couldn't even see the enemy. Modern tanks could survive dozens of hits from Heigo guns without damage. The gap between 1930s design and 1950s warfare was simply too great to bridge. Today, the surviving Heigos in museums serve as reminders of the Pacific War's brutal arithmetic. They sit next to American Shermans in displays that illustrate the industrial disparity between Japan and the United States. Visitors can see the contrast. The Heigo small, cramped, thinly armoured with a weapon inadequate against its primary opponents. The Sherman large, spacious, heavily armoured by Pacific War standards, armed with a gun that could destroy any Japanese tank with a single hit. The comparison tells the story without words. The Heigo also serves as a cautionary tale about military procurement and strategic planning. Japan built thousands of tanks optimized for fighting China, then found itself fighting the United States. The tanks couldn't be quickly upgraded or replaced because Japan's industrial base was already operating at maximum capacity. So Japanese tank crews fought in vehicles they knew were inadequate, following tactics they knew would fail, because no alternative existed. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Heigo story. The tank itself was a reasonable design given Japan's constraints. The tragedy lies in the strategic decisions that led to those constraints, the doctrine that misused the tanks once built, and the military culture that sent crews into hopeless battles, rather than acknowledging that Japanese armour couldn't compete with American industrial might. The young men who crewed Heigos were brave, well-trained in the early war years, and dedicated to their duty. They deserved better than to be sent against Shermans in tanks that couldn't protect them, with guns that couldn't hurt their enemies, following orders that guaranteed their deaths. The mathematics were established at De Mortis in December 1941 and played out across every Pacific battlefield until 1945. American armour was superior in protection, firepower, crew efficiency, logistics support, tactical flexibility, and industrial sustainability. Japanese armour had courage and determination, virtues that proved insufficient against overwhelming material superiority. In the end, the Type 95 Heigo became a symbol of Japan's larger failure, the attempt to fight an industrial war without industrial capacity, to overcome material disadvantage through fighting spirit, to compensate for systemic weakness through individual sacrifice. These approaches failed in tank warfare, as they failed in every other aspect of the Pacific War. The day the Japanese Heigo met American armour was the day that became mathematically certain, even if it took 4 more years of fighting to reach the inevitable conclusion.